Our 5,000 INV program. I'm sorry, 5,000 INV DTI program. It's extremely important to differentiate the two. Again, what's our philosophy? You're willing to provide more documentation, you'll get better pricing. You're willing to meet higher standards, you'll get better pricing. You'll get a higher LTV. It's a very simple philosophy. It just goes hand in hand across the board with our products. So the DTI that we're using is actually not the borrower's income. It's the property income. So what happens is our DTI calculation is, for those of you that are familiar with commercial loans, is basically like a debt service coverage ratio. Very simple formula where you're taking the rental income relative to the PITI. Simple formula. What's the debt service on the property, right? You want to get better pricing, you got to meet that requirement on this program, while on the prior program, the 5,000 INV, there's no DTI. So on the prior program, the 5,000 INV, you could be negative every month. We're not qualifying you on that. We're not suggesting that the property has to debt service itself on the other program, but you have a higher rate. On this program, you do have the issue of qualifying the property's debt service relative to its rental payments, and the consideration of these numbers are looked at very closely to qualify. So we use, in the case of the INV DTI, we use what comes back on the rental survey and or the lease, whichever is lower. So if the property has a lease at $2,000, but the rental survey comes back at $1,900, we're going to take the $1,900 monthly rent. That's our calculation for the DTI. That's the only consideration for DTI calculation. Now, for those of you that have looked at this closely, if you look closely at this calculation, the last column on the right-hand side on page 1 says DTI 80. People thinking in the income world DTI calculations for borrowers. 80, you do 80 DTI, oh, that's crazy. How do you qualify it? We're talking about debt service coverage, right? We're talking about qualifying the property, its rental income relative to its debts, monthly PITI. Yes? Do we make any exceptions to 90? Depends. What's the compensating factor here? Are we talking about lower LTV? That may be considered. In the case of this program does not have anything to do with ATR. Again, the reason that this program allows for no income from the borrower, no qualification, is that this program, investment properties, are exempt from ATR. It's important to understand that. So in this case, the compensating factor is not benefit to the borrower. It's what's the compensating factor on the element. So now the LTV does make a difference. Not on owner-occupied and second homes, but on this program, the compensating factor would be the strength of the borrower, reserves, LTV, the traditional mindset of compensating factors, not the ATR type of issues and compliance issues. These programs, investment properties, are exempt from ATR. So there's more flexibility if the deal makes sense. Now, what you'll find here, if you look closely on the matrix, is you will also find that depending on the LTV and FICO score on this chart, you're going to have 6 months to 12 months reserve requirements. Unlike the other program, the INV with no DTI, this program will go to 620 FICO score, while the other one minimum is 640 FICO score. But at 620 FICO score to 639 FICO score, you've got automatically 12 months reserve requirements on this. So for a borrower that has less than 640 FICO score, this is the only program they'll be eligible for. They will not be eligible for the other program. And they're going to have to put 12 months reserve, and your max LTV is 65. Again, this one also has similar scenarios where you got first-time investors having max LTV. Please look at the highlighted section at the bottom of your guidelines. You'll see first-time investors max 65 max LTV. But look at the top. On a purchase transaction with 720 FICO score for a seasoned investor, you can actually go to 80 under this program, 20% down on a non-owner property with no income qualifying, right? For a seasoned investor, only with 6 months reserves. 80 LTV non-owner, effectively, is what we're saying here, right? Yes, Mr. Stephen?
lot of contradictions. None 6 months, same LTV across the board. Most of them. It's only two of them. It is on every one else. The only two is the 80 LTV on top of 75, and the other one is 719, 75, 75. The hour goes 75, 75, 79. Look at all the other ones. Well, the same exact LTV, but yet says no reserve 6 months. It's loan size. So no, loan size not. It's not.
Well, we'll take a look at that. I'll talk to him and we'll look. Yeah, we'll take a closer look at that and we'll deal with that issue. But overall, it's important to understand the higher FICO score, the higher LTV allowed on this program for the stronger borrower. So let's move on. Same philosophies as I mentioned regarding the borrower. Folks, let's continue on the same road. Now, one thing I want to tell you, which is very important, is that if you want to take cash out, you're going to need 12-month seasoning on these programs. Across the board in general, on all of our programs, you need 12-month seasoning in order to do cash out using the new value. So a borrower that has just bought the property and wants to do a rate and term refi, our standard would be 6 months. We make exceptions depending on the program. With less than that using the new value. On a cash out, you're going to need 12 months. So that's something to consider with regards to seasoning, whether it's cash out or rate and term refi. We're going to be especially sensitive on this product, I will tell you. And the INV and the INV DTI, we're not looking for somebody to buy a property and come back 4 months later and say, hey, you know what, I'm looking to cash out and use the new value. This is not, ATM, basically. Any questions regarding these programs? Quite often, I want to, by the way, point out something I wanted to make sure everybody's aware. Quite often, I get asked the question as to why do we have mandatory escrow accounts, basically. And that's not something we waive or can waive. Generally speaking, non-QM loans require, especially on owner and second homes, impounds are mandatory. That's not optional by a lender at all. So some brokers who don't understand that like to argue and want us to waive impounds, and they've even called me, but they don't get it. And we try to explain to them that, hey, it's the law. You have to have impounds by law, and they still argue it. So I want to make sure you're all up to speed and, can answer that question. Yes?
You said you can't use cash out proceeds for reserves. Can you use some of the cash out to set up the impound?
Well, you wouldn't need to because it automatically does. If you're taking cash out, before the cash out to you would actually be for the impounds. You're fine.
What about for delinquent taxes?
Excellent question. Delinquent taxes, I was about to get into that. Generally speaking, we don't allow taxes, property taxes, delinquent to be paid through closing. We have made quite a few exceptions. In fact, I'm funding a loan tomorrow that I made an exception for about $320,000 of exceptions. That's closing tomorrow. It's a $1.3 million loan in Texas. So I think it's 60 LTV if I'm not mistaken. But the borrower had such extensive delinquencies that the tax liens were purchased by a third party and sort of turned into a semi-mortgage, consolidated. So it's very advanced. So we have made exceptions, but that's an exception to guidelines. Why is it an exception? On your file, I won't make an exception.
Yeah, no.
Okay. Since you don't want it.
I got a file where they just came like that. They said the taxes are delinquent. They got to get paid before we close.
Depends on the deal. Depends on the LTV. Depends on the This was a low LTV. It's not like we're playing favoritism. No, on the INV program, remember, the concern with these property taxes in general is that if the borrower hasn't been making their property tax payments, it's concerning. Remember, what do we have on an INV loan? We have a property, we have a credit report. Yeah, it's a risk. So we require generally a lower LTV helps offset that. In this case, this borrower is actually has got actually several exceptions. One of them is even cash out. I think they're getting on top of it another $700,000 in cash out. But it's a lower LTV loan. Again, in this product, LTV speaks, right? You got two appraisals, and you have an appraisal review on top of it, right? So you got several factors in this. It's actually a very nice property in Dallas, Texas. So, you know, it all depends on the circumstances, and that's really where that comes into play. I'm sorry? We require impounds on every program we have. That's mandatory. That's not even optional. That's not even up for discussion. There's no waiver. I've heard of that a few times, and I've had some brokers call me directly to complain and want me to waive it. I just want you to know that's impossible, so save them the trouble. That's why I'm trying to educate you. So. Yes. On the INV, there's more flexibility, but we would not waive impounds on an INV loan with no. On primary and second homes, it's not even legal to waive impounds. That's mandatory. On the INV, it's optional, but since we're getting so little documentation, there's no way we'll waive impounds. So just as a blanket rule, impounds are mandatory, period. No exceptions ever. How's that? All right, folks, let's have one conversation again. So with that being said, are there any questions? Most of our programs, if you look in the guidelines, we allow LLCs for vesting. Very important to be aware of. And in addition to that, you need to know that anybody on the LLC that owns more than 10% or more will have to sign a personal guarantee, even if they're not on the loan. So what happens is that we require the LLC paperwork. Anybody who's listed as a member of 10% or more will sign a one-page personal guarantee and verify also that the LLC has the authority to actually get into this loan. Remember that the loan now is bound by the borrower and the LLC, combination of the two. The docs that go out actually have the personal guarantee in them for the borrower to sign. It happens concurrently in our loan docs. The personal guarantee is critical in that respect. And a part of the requirements for the LLC, of course, having an IRS tax number, we require an IRS form, we ask for the operating agreement, articles of formation, the standard documentation that would be required. Now, one other factor I want to mention regarding specifically the 5,000 INV, Inv Dti, and other investment programs. We are one of the few lenders that treats these loans as business purpose loans. And as such, when they do cash out, you'll see conditions that specifically ask them to give their business purpose explanation. It's basically asking them to tell us why they're taking cash out on the property for business purposes. As soon as they write that letter and they tell us that they're looking to take a European vacation, that loan becomes disqualified for the program. So the cash out is required for business purposes. I want to fix up the property. I want to invest in another property. It's got to be an investment purpose cash out, bottom line. It's got to be a business purpose cash out. That also leads into the fact that on all investment properties on our non-QM programs, we do not use TRID. We're GFE based, which avoids a lot of headaches, a lot of problems. So the programs that you see that have the GFE start off, the program code actually says GFE 5,000. So we try to use the good faith estimate and go back to the good old-fashioned way of GFE and HUDs on loans that don't need to have TRID. That saves everybody a lot of headaches, waste of time, faster closings, no CDs, not having to wait 3 days, blah, blah, blah.